The birthplace of Western civilization almost did not survive. Around 1200 BCE, the palaces of Mycenaean Greece began to disintegrate. Cities were destroyed by fire, trade routes broke down, and writing disappeared, mainly after the fall, only reappearing centuries later with a new alphabet in the 8th century BCE. For generations, Greece drifted through what historians call the Dark Ages. Yet from this collapse arose not only silence, but also the first sparks of freedom and reason. How could a shattered society lose almost everything, only to create something entirely new? How did villages and poems achieve what palaces could not? Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. The collapse that transformed everything began with the disappearance of the Mycenaean palaces, the very centers of Greece's Bronze Age civilization. These were not merely royal residences, but the hubs of politics, economy, and culture. Palaces contained vast storerooms where tribute in the form of grain, oil, and wine flowed in from the surrounding land. Scribes working with clay tablets inscribed in Linear B recorded inventories and taxes in a line-by-line format. Artisans crafted fine goods, while traders and soldiers extended the palace's influence beyond its walls. It was an interconnected system of authority, redistribution, and belief. And then, within a few generations, it collapsed. Fires ravaged grand halls, sites were abandoned, and the scribes laid down their styluses forever. Scholars still debate why. Some point to raiders, those shadowy sea peoples whose movements disrupted societies across the eastern Mediterranean. Others suggest uprisings from within, as hungry farmers turned against rulers who could no longer guarantee food supplies. Climate evidence hints at drought, while seismic activity in a land riddled with fault lines may have shaken its delicate economy. Even distant volcanic events have been proposed. Many hypotheses exist, such as migration, social breakdown, climate shifts, or natural disasters. But the surviving evidence is incomplete and contested. What remains certain is this: the centralized palace system could not recover, and with its fall, written records ceased. Our understanding of their world is almost accidental. Clay tablets were typically dissolved in the damp soil of valleys and plains. But when palaces burned, the intense heat fused the clay, hardening it like pottery. Unintentionally, destruction preserved fragments. This is why we can find traces of the bureaucracy, albeit only in fragments. Much has vanished forever, and even the names of kings who ruled during this period are lost to history. For the people experiencing this upheaval, the impact would have been brutal. Families who once depended on central storehouses now had to produce, store, and safeguard their own food. No central army arrived to ensure safety. No scribe recorded the harvests, and no palace distributed oil or grain during bad seasons. Survival depended on households. They planted crops, managed herds, and prayed that winter would not strip them of their livelihood. For those raised under the protection of grand halls, it must have felt like the world was shrinking. Palaces reduced to ruins, ships no longer calling at harbors, painted walls replaced by plain huts. Compared with Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Greek collapse was strikingly final. Egypt endured turmoil, but it still produced pharaohs to oversee the harvests. Mesopotamian kings claimed divine approval to rule even when boundaries shifted. Greece, however, did not restore monarchy or empire. The palace states did not rise again. Instead, scattered villages took root, household-based subsistence replacing sprawling networks of control. Life contracted to the scale of valleys and hillsides. Communities remained small, often no larger than extended families working together on the land. They built modest dwellings rather than monumental halls, and they left little durable record beyond broken pottery and simple graves. Historians refer to this long period as the Dark Ages, not because life disappeared, but because its traces left so little for us to read. Yet persistence persisted. Knowledge of farming, weaving, and metalworking did not vanish, though it operated at a more local level. The skills of survival were passed down through generations. As families adapted, they developed new ways of working together. Village life required bargaining, mutual defense, and shared labor. Without kings, authority derived from necessity and those who were able to guide or persuade. It is important to remember that collapse is not just destruction. It removes forms of power that seem everlasting, creating space for new arrangements. In the Mycenaean era, authority flowed downward from palaces. After the collapse, it shifted to a more horizontal structure, rooted in households and communities. A world that once demanded obedience to palatial kings had quietly fostered a society that would later debate and decide in assemblies. If recovery had not occurred, the shape of later Mediterranean culture would likely have been very different. Without Greece's later rise, Rome might not have inherited its legal and artistic legacy. Without the return of writing, epic songs might not have been preserved. But recovery did occur, and it happened gradually, seated in resilience during centuries that offered little glamour but considerable endurance. Historians view this age with both frustration and fascination. Frustration because the evidence is so sparse: burned debris, fragmentary tablets, scattered ruins. Fascination because from that limited evidence emerged one of the most remarkable cultural renewals in world history. Rarely has such a total collapse been followed by such a revival. The foundation for Greece's future was laid in hardship, not splendor. As fields were tilled and households endured, fragments of memory persisted. Firesides became places where songs and stories kept alive echoes of the past. Parents told their children about battles once fought, ships once sailed, heroes who once strode across a grander stage. In this way, memory carried what records could not. And over time, those spoken memories began to shape something greater. They were not the edicts of kings, but the retellings of a community, voices struggling against silence. These songs and stories outlived the collapse itself, preparing the ground for a new sense of identity in Greece, a continuity rooted not in rule, but in shared recollection. It may seem impossible, but after the collapse, Greece forgot how to write, yet somehow still remembered its heroes. Stories told in the dark became the backbone of Greek identity, and none shaped that memory more than the epics attributed to Homer. These poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, served as powerful vessels of remembrance, carrying echoes of lost glory into the small villages and scattered farms. Most scholars now view Homeric poetry as a product of the Dark Ages, centuries after the fall of the palaces, yet imbued with lingering traces of the Bronze Age preserved through oral tradition. The result was not a straightforward record of Mycenaean life, but a blend of remembered images from a vanished era set within the realities of a new one. Imagine a nighttime gathering, a community brought together, a singer's voice rising above the crackle of fire. The story recounts Troy's walls, fleets crossing the sea, disputes among leaders, and the fate of heroes. No pen writes these scenes. They live only in rhythm and measure, sustained by repetition and pattern. Milman Parry's work in the 20th century demonstrated how singers could carry thousands of lines. They used formulas and epithets, such as swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered dawn, that fit into place, allowing vast poems to be recreated in performance. These features were not mere decoration. They were the memory engine of the age, enabling entire histories to survive without the need for writing. The question often arises, do Homer's epics tell us exactly how things were? For over a century, scholars debated whether there was a real Trojan War and how much of these songs actually recall it. Today, most agree on a compromise. Glimpses of Bronze Age practices survive, such as shields and weapons, yet they appear within a world shaped by the centuries that followed the collapse. This means we should not read Homer as a direct history of palaces, but as a mirror of Dark Age life that still carries shadows of earlier splendor. The politics within these poems reflect precisely this mixture. In Linear B, the Mycenaean ruler is referred to as the Wanax, the high king who stood at the apex of the palace system. In Homer, Wanax remains but appears rarely, associated with figures of exceptional authority. More common is the term basileus, used for local leaders and chieftains. This linguistic shift matters. It illustrates how royal authority had eroded since the age of palaces. When you hear Achilles quarreling with Agamemnon before the assembled Greeks, it reflects not an empire's command chain, but a chorus of rival leaders, bound together through necessity, pride, and fragile alliances. What these epics provided to the Greeks was not legal codes or decrees like those in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Instead, they offered narratives to prompt questioning and reflection. They asked, what occurs when anger overpowers reason? What becomes of a community when pride outweighs justice? By depicting Achilles' rage or Odysseus' trials, Homer gave form to reflection. Unlike scriptures carved into stone, these were not fixed rules handed down from gods, but adaptable, retold debates on how humans should behave. The performance itself was essential. Listening to Homer was not a passive act of entertainment, but a participation in a shared tradition. Villages gathered, children and elders alike, recognizing familiar phrases, nodding at well-known lines, awaiting familiar climaxes. This shared knowledge united people. It offered not only continuity with a heroic past, but also a language of values that each performance refreshed and reaffirmed. Homer was less a single author than a vast network of memory, a living chorus that developed over centuries before solidifying into written form when the new alphabet emerged. This is why oral poetry mattered so profoundly. Without scribes or archives, the singers became both record keepers and educators. Their memory work maintained a framework of ethics, arete or excellence, which combined strength with eloquence and loyalty, kleos, or fame, which relies on communal acknowledgement. Within this framework, no hero achieved glory alone. The community had to witness, repeat, and uphold his name. To be forgotten was to face a second death. You can see how, in this system, the line between personal ambition and group survival blurred. Achilles' choice between lasting obscurity and fleeting glory echoed the same dilemma faced by villagers. Invest in the stability of the household or risk ruin for honor outside it. Concepts of reputation, justice, and counsel, rehearsed in heroic narratives, provided a moral map for everyday conduct. And the lessons were sharp. When Agamemnon defies advice, disaster follows. When Odysseus ignores restraint, he suffers for it. These stories taught that pride could destroy leadership, rage could fracture alliances, and loyalty was the glue that held companions together. They were not abstract lectures, but vivid examples played out in narrative, absorbed by audiences who returned home weighing their own actions against those of heroes. Consider also the scale. Other civilizations anchored identity on stone proclamations by kings or decrees from gods. Greek communities instead carried their inheritance in breath and memory. The act of retelling was itself an act of cohesion, renewing both memory and values. The epics became a shared possession, each performance another thread binding dispersed villages into a broader Hellenic culture. Over time, this gave the Greeks something akin to a blueprint. They had no restored monarchy to emulate, yet they had images of leaders debating in assembly and of warriors seeking consensus before taking action. This was a form of political imagination rooted in poetry. It set expectations. Leadership might be contested, decisions debated, and glory was never the sole preserve of one king. When you compare Homer with archaeology, the contrast is striking. The palaces had left great walls and burnt ruins, but little memory. Homer offered the opposite: few stones, yet a vast imaginative inheritance, strong enough to shape identity long afterwards. It shows that for the Greeks, memory was not in what they built, but in what they sang. By the time villages grew into more organized communities, the Homeric epics continued to echo. They provided an image of collective memory, emphasizing that honor required recognition and that justice must be negotiated in council, not imposed by decree. That imaginative training prepared Greeks to see themselves as actors in shared decisions rather than subjects to absolute kings. From this oral memory, a change began. The household and the farmstead, once living in isolation, took on new significance against the backdrop of shared stories and common ideals. People who tilled their fields and tended their herds now saw themselves reflected in the struggles of heroes. They started to see themselves not only as family units, but as participants in the broader community. It is from this point that the next transformation emerged, the move from subsistence households to a new form of political life rooted in land and independence. How could the work of farmers reshape the meaning of citizenship? At first glance, tending fields seems far removed from questions of freedom or political voice. Yet in early Greece, the household farm became the foundation of a new social order. When the palaces fell, families who once relied on large storehouses now stood on their own. How they grew, stored, and protected their crops marked a quiet revolution in the sharing of power. In palace economies, wealth flowed to the center. Scribes recorded harvests on clay tablets, and central administrators redistributed grain, oil, and wine to the people. The system linked each family's survival to the ruler's demands. Once those halls burned, records stopped, and the redistributive economy collapsed. Farmers no longer carried their surplus to guarded storerooms. Instead, they kept what they harvested, traded what they could, and took the risks themselves. The Greeks referred to the unit of survival as the oikos, encompassing a household, land, tools, animals, and family, all in one. More than just a home, it was the basis of economic independence. From the oikos came the kleros, an allotment of land passed down to heirs. A kleros mattered because it encouraged long-term planning. Families could build presses, plant olives and vines, and store wine or oil in jars, confident that the labor would benefit their children. Land security fostered investment in permanence, not just survival from one year to the next. This appeared different from Egypt or Mesopotamia. There, kings still commanded central storehouses and controlled distribution. In Greece, no sovereign grain reserve stood above ordinary households. The risk was higher, but so was the independence. Each family succeeded or failed through its own effort. Farming land in Greece was often harsh, with rocky soil and unreliable rainfall, yet this system fostered resilience. Families relied on themselves and, when necessary, on neighbors. Survival required both independence and cooperation. From this tension, the early habits of citizenship emerged. The link between land and defense strengthened the connection. A plot was vulnerable unless its owner could defend it. In Greece, owning land meant being prepared to protect it. The oikos was not just an economic unit. It carried military obligations. To hold land was to be a soldier in waiting. This strong bond between farm and fight led to the concept of the citizen soldier. Scholar Victor Davis Hanson argues, convincingly to many, that the spread of small independent farms helped develop this citizen culture. He suggests that the discipline of farm life and the equal status of smallholders contributed to the development of a new kind of independence. However, not all historians agree on every detail, and there is ongoing debate about how the system took shape. Nevertheless, the overall picture is clear. Farming and autonomy were closely linked. This new system, however, was never a pure showcase of equality. Independent households often depended on hired workers or a few enslaved people. Freedom for some existed alongside dependence for others. The rise of citizen independence brought with it an uneasy paradox. The very autonomy many celebrated was partly based on the labor of those denied rights. Despite these contradictions, households that built and maintained their oikos began to see themselves as peers. Each harvest strengthened their sense of self-sufficiency. Every defense of their fields affirmed their shared responsibility. When disputes arose or threats loomed, landowning men met not as subjects of a monarch, but as equals with a shared stake in survival. This shift transformed practical farming concerns into the foundations of the political community. Status also evolved. In the palaces, wealth could be stored, hoarded, or redistributed according to the king's will. On the farm, status was more about stability and contribution. A well-managed kleros provided a family with enough to feed themselves, host neighbors at feasts, and stand ready to defend the community. Wealth was now measured not by treasure chests in grand halls, but by the productivity of the land under one's care. This gave rise to a sense of rough equality, at least among landholders with similar plots. No household was truly secure alone. Even the strongest needed allies during attacks. This need fostered cooperation, sharing burdens in harvest or war, and discussions on how best to act together. The beginnings of assemblies were already visible, places where men, used to self-reliance, also understood they must listen, debate, and decide collectively. The bond between person and land ran deep. Being part of a community meant being rooted in soil that nourished one's family and passing that connection to heirs. The kleros was both sustenance and identity. It gave men a reason to defend their land as their own and, by extension, protect the land of neighbors. The rights of belonging seemed to spring from the earth itself rather than from decrees issued by kings. As households clustered into villages, shared rituals and decisions became more prevalent. Local shrines provided spaces where memory and worship united families. The principle remained. Each man's independence was grounded in his oikos, but independence only persisted if communities united. These groups of households would become the foundation of more complex societies. From the scattered villages of the Dark Age, the polis, the city-state, gradually took shape. There was no single path. Some villages failed, while others flourished. Over centuries, Greece transitioned from isolation to reconnection. By the 8th century BCE, contact with the broader Mediterranean re-emerged. Eastern motifs began to enter Greek art during what scholars call the Orientalizing phase. Colonization ensued as Greeks established settlements abroad, seeking land and trade. Yet, the nature of the polis remained rooted in its origins, grounded in small farms and sustained by citizens who held both land and weapons. It is notable that in this world, a man was known less for obedience to rulers than for his contribution to his household and his willingness to fight. Freedom was never an abstract idea. It was carved into terraces of rocky earth, pressed into jars of wine and oil, and embodied in the hands that sowed seed and carried spears. From this, the earliest civic class arose. The men who cultivated their own land, armed themselves at their own expense, and defended their neighbors defined the beginning of citizenship. The farmer was also the warrior. The routines of fieldwork trained endurance, patience, and discipline. His shield and spear were natural extensions of his hoe and plow. Standing side by side, these farmer soldiers were more than protectors of fields. They became symbols of a broader community in arms. Their independence was personal, yet their strength was collective. The ground beneath them provided both livelihood and the duty to stand shoulder to shoulder with others like them. This partnership between farm and battlefield would leave a lasting mark on Greek society. The citizen was not an idea carved on stone tablets by kings. He was drawn from the soil, shaped by the oikos, bound by the kleros, and tested in defense of his neighbors. And it was here, in the shift from household to battlefield, that Greeks discovered something unusual. Survival no longer depended on a single ruler's command, but on how men stood together in line. What kind of weapon not only shielded you, but also required you to protect the man beside you? The Greek hoplite shield was precisely that kind of invention. Unlike a spear you could thrust alone, or a bow you could fire from a distance, this shield made no sense in isolation. It was designed so that half covered your own body, while the rest overlapped to cover your neighbor. Fighting with such a shield was not a solitary act, but a shared one. Survival depended on trust. The hoplite's shield was large and heavy, made from wood faced with bronze, and carried with a central grip that brought its weight into the forearm. Archaeologists estimate it weighed around 16 to 20 pounds. On its own, it was awkward and bulky, but together, overlapping with others, it created a bristling wall. Shoulder to shoulder, lines of hoplites pressed together, each man's left arm braced with a shield, right hand holding a spear. The gaps in one man's defense vanished because his neighbor filled them. What emerged was more than just equipment. It was a living barrier. The warfare style that grew from this is what we call the phalanx. Rows formed in depth, each leaning on the one in front, like the overlap of tiles on a roof. If one tile were lost, the roof could break. If one man failed, the line would give way. That was the principle. However, the rate at which this formation developed is still debated. scholars still argue whether the deep, rigid phalanx appeared suddenly or grew gradually over generations. Some surviving vase paintings show different fighting stances, even looser groups. Therefore, any certainty should be approached with caution. The contrast with the old world of Homer is clear. In the epics, heroes stood apart, their names linked to single combat. In the phalanx, that idea was reversed. To charge out for personal fame was to betray the line. What mattered was not standing alone, but holding ground together. Glory became collective endurance, not a duel. Courage was measured by rhythm and discipline, not by breaking ranks. When we envision those battles, we must keep two images in mind. One is the classical heroic vision: speeches, challenges, one man against another in the dust. The other, later, depicts blocks of men laboring silently, shield grinding against shield, spears piercing through the press. Here, there was little recognition and much silent effort. The slightest mistake could endanger everything. Loyalty made you part of the wall. Cowardice broke it open. Warfare like this was never solely about technique. It transformed society. If a weapon functions only when tied to your neighbor, and if defeat follows any loss of cohesion, then the principle of equality suddenly takes on a powerful meaning. In rank, each landholder stood alongside others, equal in peril, if not in wealth. For a society already shaped by independent farms, this fit was natural. The phalanx was the battlefield expression of the smallholder's life. Archaeologists also pieced together what equipment was necessary for the task. A bronze helmet, heavy, perhaps 5 pounds, pressed around the skull. A breastplate, weighing up to 40 pounds, fitted tightly to the torso. A spear 5 to 8 feet long jutted out from the front line. Each man had to carry this gear himself. And here, politics came directly into play. To be a hoplite, you generally needed your own equipment, so landowning farmers who could afford armor became the core of the army. With arms came responsibility, as well as political influence. The right to fight and the right to speak began to intertwine. The phalanx also required practice. There was no place for reckless behavior. Soldiers had to learn how to march, when to brace, and how to lean forward in the push. Every movement had to be in rhythm with those on either side of them. A misstep and the entire formation could fall apart. The most straightforward analogy is dancers in a line. One falters and the shape collapses. On the battlefield, the cost of that falter was not merely losing order, but lives. The shield, then, was never a tool of isolation. It was truly incomplete without the next shield locking in. It compelled a man to consider the life of another as intertwined with his own actions. Archaeology preserves the form of bronze and wood, but what mattered more was the habit it fostered. Trust in others, the sense that survival depended on mutual support. The design itself taught cooperation. This was a lesson written not in debates, but in bruises. The weight of metal and wood pressed onto shoulders. The pushes of the enemy pressed from the front. In moments of battle, a farmer soldier grasped the harsh truth. His life depended on the hands beside him. This did not create wealth equality. Richer men might wear finer armor, poorer ones plainer gear. But in the rank of shields, what mattered was endurance, not splendor. The ground was level in danger, if not in property. How deadly were these confrontations? Some calculations suggest hoplite battles could be costly, with perhaps double-digit casualty rates in challenging encounters. But consensus is lacking here. Other scholars warn that while the fighting could be brutal, Most wars ended with one side retreating before losses became overwhelming. What is clear is that the risk was visible, and each man's safety could disappear if his comrades faltered. What stands out is how arms and politics merged. Warfare in Egypt or Mesopotamia often emerged from kings who commanded armies through edict and supplied them. Greek warfare, on the other hand, was characterized by citizen participation. Holding a shield marked you not as someone serving a monarch, but as part of a collective of equals in arms. From that came a corresponding voice in decisions. You carried risk in battle, so you deserve a voice in council. Communities began to mirror this change. Assemblies of landowning men, who also served as hoplites, gathered to deliberate on matters of war and settlement. The crisscrossing shields in battle seemed to suggest an overlap of voices in discussion. Each was connected to the other, not just in theory, but in practice. Of course, barriers persisted. Women, enslaved people, and the poorest remained outside the circle. But within the circle of hoplite shields, a rough outline of citizenship became more defined. Your shield was both your defense and your personal pass. Without it, you stood apart. With it, you belonged to the collective. It's remarkable how a single object merged war with identity. Politics in Greece did not only develop in assembly halls, it grew from wood and bronze, pressed against arms, soaked with sweat. The shield carried the community as tangibly as it covered the body. Each battle reiterated this truth. To defend your neighbor was not simply noble, but a matter of necessity. To fail was to risk bringing ruin upon all. The habit of locking shields in battle also fostered the habit of acting together afterwards. This was central to Greek political life, sharing the burden of defense, which extended into communal debates at home. The battlefield taught cooperation most brutally. Yet, after the shouting ceased, questions arose. If each shield held equal weight against the enemy, how should fairness be judged when disputes erupted within the community? Who decides what is right when no king issues the command? Justice in the polis was never a luxury. It was a necessity. Without monarchs or divine kings to enforce order, early Greek communities had to devise new methods to resolve disputes and maintain peace. Households could farm, defend themselves, and preserve their traditions, but they could not, on their own, set standards for an entire society. For collective survival, some principle larger than family ties was essential. That principle was justice, and in Greece, it came to be understood not as the command of one king, but as something the whole community had to recognize. Hesiod, one of the earliest poets whose work still survives, expressed this truth vividly. He pictured Dike, the goddess of justice, walking among people in their towns and villages. In his portrayal, when justice prevailed, fields thrived and families prospered. But when justice was distorted or ignored, crops failed, children suffered, and entire communities declined. Hesiod's imagery linked morality directly to survival. Justice was not distant, fixed in a king's decree. It was alive, observing, and present in everyday life. This vision met an urgent need. Without kings, disagreements could quickly escalate into feuds. One family insulted might retaliate, leading to endless cycles of vengeance. To break that cycle, a higher framework of fairness trusted by all was necessary. In a world where rulers no longer stood above, trust was built through shared recognition. Justice was upheld not because a monarch commanded it, but because the community relied on it. Hesiod's warning gave weight to this fragile balance. By imagining Dyke watching and remembering, he reminded Greeks that justice was always near, always binding. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where king and law were intertwined and rulers claimed divine authority over right and wrong, the Greeks increasingly placed the responsibility of fairness within the polis itself. The polis, the cluster of households, meeting places, and shrines that formed a town, became the seat of justice. It was not just about walls or homes. It was the arena where disputes were debated, outcomes decided, and the moral order preserved. This shift brought about two consequences. First, it distributed responsibility. Fairness was no longer the duty of a single ruler, but of all members of the community. When councils of elders assembled, or when villagers appealed to assemblies to settle disputes, every decision had a profound impact on the collective well-being of the community. A biased judgment harmed the entire polis, just as a fair one strengthened it. Second, justice became political. Decisions about fairness also involved choices about what united society, guidelines that might vary across regions, but were vital because they represented an agreed-upon order. Please think of the polis as a vessel into which people poured their disputes and hopes. This vessel held quarrels safely, preventing violence from spilling over and damaging the community. Without it, cycles of revenge would corrode local life. With it, a system larger than the household could test claims and deliver resolutions. This is why Hesiod condemned leaders who corrupted justice for bribes, warning that corruption weakened the very foundation of society. His message was clear: justice was not an ornament, but the essential condition for prosperity. For Greek communities, this marked a new experiment. They were transitioning from private vengeance to collective responsibility. When disputes were settled, not with swords, but through consensus, politics was born. The polis became a stage where moral order took on a local, institutional form. Debating what was just was no longer purely a moral matter. It was the earliest form of lawmaking. This did not mean Greek justice was always fair or equal. Some voices held more influence than others. Women, enslaved people, and non-landowners were excluded. Yet, what mattered was the principle itself. In disputes among citizens, fairness belonged to the group, not solely to an individual ruler. The polis, even in its early days, provided justice with a shared shape. Over time, this collective sense of fairness became intertwined with ritual and law. Rules were formalized, disputes brought before assemblies, and oaths sworn before gods. But its root was already present in Hesiod's voice, reminding communities that Dyke walked among them. If justice failed, both soil and city declined. If it prevailed, both thrived. This truth shaped how Greeks perceived themselves, not merely as subjects obeying decrees, but as members of a community united by shared fairness. Justice in the polis contrasted sharply with older palace states. Bronze Age Mycenaean kings had once embodied authority. Their fall left a vacuum, but into that space came not silence or memory alone, but a principle held in everyday life. To live without monarchs meant to coexist with one another, recognizing rules greater than any individual's will. That fragile, remarkable achievement was the polis. Communities realized that their survival depended on more than farming or defense. It relied on their ability to judge fairly, restrain vengeance, and safeguard fairness from corruption. Ignoring this risk led to collapse. Defending it encouraged growth. Justice, rather than monarchy, became the foundation of social order. This system was fragile, disputed, never certain, but it endured. Its resilience helped define Greece against its neighbors, transforming justice from a king's tool into something collective and profoundly political. It left early citizens with a lasting challenge. Once justice is seen as shared, they must also find ways to debate, decide, and uphold it together. This is why the Polis had to develop means of managing discussion and settling disputes, because unchecked revenge would tear apart the fragile social fabric. What happens when power shifts from palaces to the open spaces of the city? For centuries, the Near East relied on palaces, kings, and courts that concentrated authority in the hands of a few. Pharaohs governed the Nile Valley, while Mesopotamian cities served monarchs who claimed a divine right. Greece, however, took a different route. Instead of commands emanating from a single ruler, power was tested in gatherings where citizens debated and decided. This change became a defining feature of political life in the Polis. The lack of monarchy following the collapse of palaces made this shift possible. Without a divine ruler to unify the land, families concentrated on farms and villages. From these units, new polis arose. Each needed a method to settle disputes, decide on wars, and organize rituals. Where kings once enforced authority, now authority had to be negotiated. Who could speak? Who should lead? No answer was permanent. Gatherings became the solution. Councils of elders or leading families, the boule, formed first, providing continuity through aristocratic bodies. Yet assemblies open to a broader group of citizens also appeared. These assemblies, the ecclesia, gradually increased participation, although specifics varied between cities. Elsewhere, one man might issue decrees. Here, proposals were debated openly. This marked a stark departure from the monarchies of Egypt or Babylon. In Greece, authority had to persuade, not simply command. Homer's epics already alluded to this pattern. His leaders were not absolute monarchs, but figures whose decisions required support. In the Iliad, Agamemnon quarrels with other commanders. His rank offers no immunity from criticism. This reflected the experience of early Greeks, where leadership in councils and assemblies was always at risk of challenge. The throne dissolved into the gathering. Therefore, rulers had to earn authority at every meeting. That openness created tension. Could men argue freely without risking ruin? Was it safe to question leaders? Debate threatened disunity. Yet fragility bore strength. A decision that endured challenges in the assembly carried more weight than a decree enforced through silence. The agreement formed through speech persisted because many had tested and accepted it. The principle that ordinary landholders could voice views on war, law, and religion was extraordinary. Elsewhere, kings claimed divine backing for their orders. In Greece, citizens gathered to speak publicly. Even if citizenship excluded women, enslaved people, and non-landholders, the inclusion of ordinary men in the crucial debate was remarkable. It transformed farmers and soldiers into political actors. Later, thinkers gave philosophical form to this development. Aristotle famously called human beings politikon zoon, political animals. For him, life found fulfillment not in isolation, but in shared public activity. The Greeks, by establishing assemblies, gave shape to this idea. While older cultures placed divine kings between gods and men, Greeks placed responsibility squarely on the citizen body. Authority was redefined, no longer handed down by bloodline or enforced by divine sanction. It depended on persuasion. A leader had to speak well, appeal to reason, tradition, and fairness. The tools of rule were not crowns, but words. In Greece, governing meant persuading. This also transformed identity. Citizens began to see themselves not merely as subjects of rulers, but as participants who owned their polis collectively. Decisions regarding war, religion, and law were shaped through assembly debate. A campaign against a neighbor was a collective decision made by those willing to fight. Laws were remembered as agreements made through speech and open to revision. Variation across the Greek world should be highlighted. Not all polis followed the same path. Some communities strengthened aristocratic control, keeping power in few hands. Others developed oligarchies dominated by land-holding elites. Still, others, like Athens, greatly expanded participation. There was no single Greek model, only family resemblances among various experiments. Openness introduced risk. Debate could unite communities, but it could also divide them. Rival groups emerged, factions hardened, and decisions could polarize citizens. Without an acknowledged monarch to suppress opposition, discord threatened stability. Yet this was the price of shared freedom. Each voice carried weight, but no single voice could guarantee permanence. Even with this risk, moving from kingship to assembly marked a pivotal moment. For the first time, collective choice shaped government in a recognizably political way. The polis was not merely a place to live, but a forum for collective decision-making. Citizens realized that order could be maintained without monarchs if debate steered it. From these origins, traditions of law, rhetoric, and political philosophy arose, lasting long after empires elsewhere had fallen. Imagine a Greek assembly. It might have gathered in a modest courtyard rather than a grand hall. Men took turns raising their voices, considering each matter carefully. Yet those words held the power that once belonged to thrones. Authority was temporary, tested constantly through persuasion. It was governance rooted in dialogue. The contrast with monarchies is clear. Palaces along the Nile or in Mesopotamia dazzled with size and splendor, symbolizing absolute control. The Greek assembly was modest, yet its simplicity changed the meaning of politics. Citizens became participants rather than subjects, and politics transformed into debate rather than decree. Still, this was fragile. Freedom carried both danger and strength. Assemblies could unite a city or fracture it through division. The fact that many voices mattered made achieving consensus difficult. Freedom itself needed a more solid foundation to support it. That is why later Greeks turned to law. They realized that if citizens were free to speak, they also required rules to prevent chaos. Unbounded debate could tear communities apart. Only agreed laws could transform the liberty of assemblies into lasting order. This was the challenge early polis faced. Freedom in open debate, balanced with the need for stability. Their next step was to explore how law could act as the anchor for liberty, maintaining the balance between freedom and disorder. How could early communities maintain liberty without it tearing itself apart? That was the challenge Greeks faced once the palace kings were gone and open assemblies replaced royal commands. Freedom now belonged to many. But without structure, that same freedom was at risk of devolving into rivalry, continuous feuds, or chaos. The issue was not whether liberty existed, but how to balance it. The Greeks referred to the danger as dysnomia, meaning poor order or lawlessness, and contrasted it with eunomia, which represents good order, where freedom and fairness support each other. Imagine a village gathering. Men debated war or peace, settled boundaries, or argued over insults. Each had their own interest, their own anger, their own desire. Without agreed rules, the meeting risked descending into disorder, or worse, violence. Liberty could quickly unravel when boundaries were absent. What was needed was not less freedom, but a framework strong enough to shape it, just as field stones mark a plot of land. Within those stones, planting is free. Beyond them, disputes arise. Law became that framework. Not law as in dense legal codes, but agreements remembered, repeated, and enforced through custom. Law sets limits without stifling action. It disciplines speech and lends weight to judgment. It reminds each citizen that liberty relies on the community's stability, that freedom is only possible when others also recognize its boundaries. The fear of dysnomia remained acute. Greeks understood that bad order meant more than quarrels. It signified corruption seeping into leadership, assemblies distorted by factions, and bribery replacing fairness. If the strong imposed themselves unchecked, then the liberty of the weaker would collapse. Excessive freedom without law benefits only the most exploitative. Conversely, eunomia was conceived as a state of balance. Good law limits selfish ambition enough to ensure the group's survival, but never so much that individual identity disappears. Solon, the poet and statesman of Athens, articulated this balance with remarkable clarity. In his verses, he warned that corrupt rulers and dishonesty would lead to societal ruin. He urged citizens to understand that law was not distant but practical, an assurance against collapse. For Solon, eunomia was the shield that protected liberty from self-destruction. His words carried weight because they linked personal restraint to the survival of the community. Communities ignored that link at their peril. The idea was clear but memorable. Too little regulation risks chaos. Too much becomes tyranny. The goal was to find laws that protected freedom without suppressing it. This paradox shaped the identity of the polis. Law was not meant to quench liberty, but to guide it. Simultaneously, liberty was valued not because it was unlimited, but because it allowed citizens to thrive within defined boundaries. This balance was constantly challenged. Assemblies easily swayed by anger or faction risked turning into violence. Powerful landowners who bent the rules deepened resentment. Farmers burdened by debt sometimes lost their land, causing unrest that unsettled communities. These served as reminders of how quickly liberty could dissolve without a stabilizing structure. Yet, there were also instances where shared rules resolved disputes, curbed greed, and maintained peace. These were glimpses of eunomia, never permanent, but consistently enough to hold communities together just long enough to endure. The concept of eunomia stemmed not from grand theories, but from everyday life. Farmers understood that one season's excess could waste the seed for the next. Shepherds knew that overgrazed land invited disaster. Similarly, citizens came to see liberty as requiring rhythm and restraint. Without it, the community itself would become barren. With it, freedom could be passed down across generations. This was a living truth, reinforced through disputes, markets, embassies, and councils. A remarkable fact is that Greek communities did not view law as an alien force, but rather as an agreement woven into the fabric of life itself. Law was recited, repeated, committed to memory, and then enacted in assemblies or courts. It was not absolute, for corruption could always creep in, but it was present, challenged, and defended in open space. That made politics a continual negotiation between liberty and order, not a static command. For Greeks, this balance became a shared habit of thought. Unlike empires where rulers dictated law as divine command, Greek citizens learned to see themselves as both makers and guardians of law. they kept in mind the two dangers, anarchy on one side, tyranny on the other. To navigate steadily between them, that was the art of politics, fragile, complex, and full of risk. It is striking how this insight resonates far beyond antiquity. Living together freely requires rules, but rules must be fair. If they bow to power, liberty collapses. If they suffocate freedom, resentment shatters them. The Greek message was clear. Law is not the enemy of freedom, but its foundation. Without it, politics cannot function. With it, liberty can breathe without choking on its own excess. For early citizens, this realization was not merely theoretical, but experienced daily. They debated passionately, made rules, watched them break, and tried again. They understood that selfishness must be restrained, but not by silencing voices. Instead, restraint was achieved through a collective agreement, reaffirmed as often as necessary. By naming this ideal condition as eunomia, they recognized good order as the basis for true freedom. That is why this balance was always delicate. It required constant vigilance and renewal. If tilted too far in one direction, assemblies could descend into violence. Tilted too far the other way, leaders could become tyrants. Only within the shifting space between these extremes did liberty endure. The fact that the Greeks maintained this delicate balance for centuries was remarkable in itself. It provided their communities with resilience and prepared their imaginations for future challenges. Once they had set limits on their own freedom, a natural question arose. If citizens could debate and judge one another, could they also challenge powers once deemed invincible? If human assemblies governed themselves, what about the gods who had long stood above them? This tension began to stir within the Greek mind, and it was in religion itself that the spirit of debate was about to make a remarkable turn. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, gods ruled with unquestioned authority. Kings carried divine blessing, temples anchored daily life, and tradition left little room for challenge. In Greece, however, a different approach began to emerge. Here, people started asking new kinds of questions. What if the gods were not always just? What if their stories revealed limits rather than perfection? And most surprisingly, what if human thought could share the stage with divine power? This was not rejection. Greeks did not abandon rituals or beliefs, but they allowed curiosity and doubt to coexist with reverence. That combination set them apart from many of their neighbors. Poets were among the first to challenge these boundaries. They retold myths not only as sacred stories, but as tales for reflection. When listeners heard of Zeus deceiving Hera or Athena outthinking her rivals, they were invited to see gods with human failings: anger, jealousy, pride. Unlike the carved images of distant deities in Egypt, Greek portrayals revealed conflict among immortals themselves. To see gods quarrel was to imagine that divine power could be flawed. If the gods themselves admitted limits, could mortals question them too? Of course, exploring those doubts came with a warning. Hubris, overstepping pride, held a special place in Greek thought. The myths repeatedly showed that arrogance invited ruin, a pattern the Greeks described as hubris, leading to delusion, and ultimately ending in nemesis, downfall. Sophocles' Oedipus stands as the most potent example. In defying warnings, pushing too far, and seeking mastery even of fate, Oedipus triggers his own undoing. His story was not unusual, but emblematic, showing audiences that even the cleverest and boldest could be blinded by pride and destroyed by its consequences. The pattern echoed through tragedy. Heroes might rise high, achieve greatness, even inspire admiration, but the flaw of hubris drew them towards collapse. It was a moral pattern woven into the culture, ingrained through ritual storytelling. Yet even as these dramas warned of human limits, they also permitted audiences to scrutinize the gods more closely. If Oedipus could fall due to pride, might the gods themselves be guilty of similar excess? This was not ridicule so much as reflection. It made divine power a subject for examination. This created a distinctive balance in Greek culture. On one hand, rituals filled the calendar. Every polis maintained shrines, performed sacrifices, and honored the gods. Religion served as social glue, binding communities together. On the other hand, poets, dramatists, and even comedians questioned divine justice, laughed at divine missteps, and speculated about the limits of power. They did not abandon religion. Ritual remained central, but they allowed for critical questioning alongside it. And asking questions was no longer seen as destructive. It became an integral part of life in the polis. This spirit of questioning fostered a tragic view of human life itself. Mortals appeared fragile, vulnerable to loss and anger, and always subject to forces beyond their control. Yet, at the same time, they were capable of extraordinary courage, wisdom, and achievement. Heroes symbolized this duality. Human lives were governed by fate, but within those boundaries lay opportunities for remarkable acts. Facing tragedy was not despair. It was honesty. Recognizing suffering as inevitable was not an admission of defeat, but a pursuit of excellence, understanding the cost involved. This tragic honesty opened a space for reason. If stories of gods revealed contradictions and poets and dramatists highlighted their flaws, then perhaps not all knowledge required divine authority. In the environment of the polis, thinkers increasingly used observation and argument to explain the natural world. Early Greek natural philosophy began to investigate the universe through reason, alongside myth. Seasons could be studied, stars observed, and illnesses explained without solely attributing them to divine anger. Rational inquiry did not replace faith, but rather supplemented it, providing an alternative path to understanding. The distinction becomes clear when Greece is compared with its neighbors. In Egypt, the principle of Ma'at ensured order, a truth upheld and protected by pharaohs in league with the gods. Mesopotamian law codes presented divine command as the fundamental basis for justice and order. Few voices questioned whether the gods themselves acted justly. In Greece, however, citizens recited tales of quarreling gods, philosophers pondered whether the world had natural foundations, and dramatists embedded warnings into the flaws of blind obedience. The remarkable aspect is not that they rejected worship, but that they combined it with critique. Curiosity itself was validated. That gave Greek politics a new shape. If the gods could be questioned, then leaders could too. If myths could be retold as stories for examination, so could traditions of power and law. Festivals and sacrifices continued to take place, but they existed within a cultural climate where debate and critical inquiry held equal importance. Questioning was transformed from potential impiety into civic duty. To raise arguments became not only acceptable, but commendable, part of the excellence a citizen was meant to display. For me, what matters is how these strands are integrated. The tragic worldview set limits. Mortals must accept boundaries. Hubris leads to downfall. But those same stories empowered critique, encouraging listeners to evaluate divine authority itself. From that interaction arose the freedom to reason, observe, and engage in argument. The The Greek achievement was not the invention of religion or the rejection of it, but the capacity to live in both states simultaneously, believing and questioning. This coexistence fostered a culture capable of nurturing philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and political reflection, all within the framework of ritual and tradition. It meant that human greatness was no longer imagined solely as a gift from the gods. It could be the result of discipline, courage, and inquiry. The tragic hero embodied this truth, flawed yet admirable, doomed yet instructive. Oedipus's fall served as a warning, but also revealed the relentless drive for knowledge. From this standpoint, rational thought gained confidence. Observing nature provided its own explanations. Political arguments followed the same questioning approach. The Polis became not just a stage for worship and debate, but a space where reason and tradition coexisted. In a world where monarchs elsewhere still invoked divine command to justify power, Greeks had discovered a different kind of liberty, the liberty to question even the sources of their own identity. What emerged was a culture at ease with contradiction. Sacrifices at temples coexisted with philosophical speculation. Myths honored gods while also revealing their flaws. Rational inquiry stood alongside faith as a partner, sometimes as an irritant, and always as a challenge. From that mixture, Greek identity grew sharper and more resilient, and as inquiry gained legitimacy, a new question began to emerge. If courage, reason, and achievement mattered so greatly, did greatness belong to individuals themselves, or only when recognized by the community? Glory in Greece was never merely a matter of private triumph. For the Greeks, greatness took shape in the presence of others. Excellence held value when it was visible in the polis, judged and remembered not just by family, but by the entire community that carried memory forward. The Greeks used the word aret to describe human excellence. Aret was not limited to a single skill. It represented the fullness of capacity in strength, courage, wisdom, and speech. A warrior could demonstrate it in battle, a leader in council, a speaker in assembly, or an athlete in sport. What mattered was striving for the highest form of ability in whatever role was required. The ideal of kalos kagathos, beautiful and good, embodied this sense of wholeness, blending physical prowess with moral worth, recognized by peers who witnessed it. However impressive aret might appear, it was fleeting without kleos. Kleos signified fame, remembered and repeated, the endurance of deeds beyond death. Achilles' famous choice captures this perfectly: live long and obscure, or die young and attain lasting fame. For the Greeks, kleos was the link between fleeting brilliance and lasting fame. Without voices to recount it, no act endured. With them, memory could span generations. This meant greatness was always shared between the individual who acted and the community that remembered. Consider Odysseus, whose aret lay in resourcefulness and cunning. Without poets recounting his long voyage, his cleverness would vanish into silence. Or Achilles, unmatched in martial power. His rage and glory mattered because others celebrated them. The pattern was clear: no memory, no kleos. And without kleos, aret dissolved into nothing. Greeks observed this in practice. Funeral games honored the dead not only with mourning, but also with contests that demonstrated their worth to others. Poets reciting heroic stories, athletes competing at festivals, and orators speaking in assemblies, all transformed private skills into public recognition. Each act served as a means of kleos, embedding memory into song, stone, or ritual. The community became both the witness and protector of glory. This expectation influenced how citizens viewed their lives. Acting bravely, wisely, or justly was never solely a personal matter. It was directly connected to how the polis valued you. Cowardice or cruelty brought shame not only to an individual, but also to the household and the community. Conversely, virtues displayed publicly elevated both the individual and the city. People constantly lived under the watch of neighbors, soldiers, judges, and poets. This gaze fostered both restraint and ambition. This does not reduce Greek identity to vanity. It shows that the polis itself amplified significance. An ordinary life can be transformed into something meaningful if others choose to remember it. A citizen's story grew stronger when fellow citizens retold and upheld it. The polis integrated individual achievement into collective heritage. In this way, excellence became a dialogue, not just a possession. Festivals made this dialogue visible. Athletes challenged themselves before crowds, their records immortalized in monuments. Poets composed epics that woven past heroes into present memory, binding listeners into a shared story. Orators aimed to sway assemblies, their reputations rising or falling based on the quality of their speech. In each case, greatness appeared before others' eyes and ears. Arete proved itself. Kleos preserved it. The partnership between individual effort and public witness helped shape society. The hope of being remembered and spoken of beyond one's lifetime inspired citizens to push beyond their personal limits. It also benefited the community, providing heroes, victories, and lessons to define its identity. When Arete became part of the public record, it no longer belonged solely to the individual who demonstrated it. Instead, it became a shared attribute. It became an aspect of the polis itself. Even morality embraced this perspective. Justice, bravery, and moderation gained strength because they were observed and appreciated. Acting well made sense because it restored trust within the city and fostered respect across generations. Hesiod and Solon both warned leaders that distorting justice would harm the entire community. Conversely, integrity elevated both private honor and collective resilience. Glory, measured through memory, motivated men to act in ways that benefited the city as much as themselves. To understand this dynamic, imagine a citizen soldier standing in the phalanx. He holds his shield not just for his own safety, but for the neighbor it protects. That physical overlap of shields also symbolized the overlap of memory. Each fought for personal courage, but courage could not endure without others seeing, recalling, and passing it on. The formation itself reflected the culture's pattern. Individuals were tested, while communities remembered. Seen this way, the Greek self cannot be separated from the polis. Recognition carried importance equal to achievement. Poets, games, assemblies, festivals, and inscriptions all worked together to link memory with action. The individual aimed for excellence, but it was the polis that made it immortal. Without public witness, the strongest athlete, the wisest speaker, or the bravest soldier could fade from history. This culture was demanding. It permitted no private comfort of hidden honor. The approval of others judged everything. Yet, it also offered a reward, the opportunity for a personal life to echo after death, carried in stories and commemorations. To Greeks, this was not vanity, but an answer to mortality itself. Life ended, Kleos endured. In this way, Greek greatness became less about individual achievement and more about a system where glory was shared. The citizens contributed skill or courage. The polis preserved it, repeated it, and immortalized it in stone or song. Only through this partnership did true glory exist. From this partnership, something remarkable emerged. While other civilizations left behind grand palaces or temples, the Greeks propagated ideas. Above all, the belief that political life, memory, and freedom could unite ordinary households into a lasting identity. That innovation would surpass kings and empires alike. From these threads of community and recognition emerged something new: the polis, the invention that outlived empires. While many ancient civilizations left behind monumental ruins, Greece's lasting contribution lay in a small-scale experiment that reshaped how people understood politics and society. The polis was fragile, often quarrelsome, but it carried within it a durable set of ideas: freedom, law, and communal identity that proved far less perishable than stone. Initially, the polis seemed improbable. Compared with sprawling empires, it was modest, a city with surrounding farmland, its population small and resources limited. According to some estimates, there were hundreds, if not over 1,000, independent polis scattered across Greece and its colonies. Most were nowhere near Athens in scale. Aristotle even suggested that the ideal number of citizens was just over 5,000, a size he believed struck a balance between intimacy and sustainability. These figures remind us that Greek political innovation was born not from grand empires, but from compact local communities. What made the polis distinctive was not its size, but its practice. Whereas others built pyramids or ziggurats to display permanence, these city-states focused on cultivating habits of shared governance and administration. Citizens gathered in assembly halls or public squares, where issues were debated rather than decreed. Councils discussed justice. Farmers defended their land. Poets preserved memory, and the law limited conflict. The polis was less about physical structures and more about a culture of participation. This was reinforced by another significant development. Literacy returned. Around the mid-8th century BCE, Greeks adapted the Phoenician script into a new alphabet. This was more than just a technical change. It enabled poems to be recorded, laws to be inscribed in stone, and agreements to be preserved beyond memory. Writing strengthened the foundations of assemblies, enhanced the continuity of law, and allowed the experiments of these small cities to endure beyond the lives of their founders. Think for a moment about how empires differ. Assyria expanded through military terror and administrative control, with its kings ruling vast territories until the empire collapsed. And with that collapse, its political model vanished. Persia extended its governance across regions through a monarchy and local governors, impressive in scope but closely linked to a single imperial framework. Greece's polis offered something different. Its model was portable. Unlike empires that relied on armies and capitals, the polis was a form of political life that could be transplanted into colonies. What was exported wasn't walls or monuments, but practices, assemblies, councils, shared laws, and festivals that unified communities. An analogy helps. Empires resembled monumental architecture, striking while it stood, but useless once empty. The polis resembled a language. Even if one city fell, others could speak its political vocabulary again, through citizen debate, collective defense, and law. That portability, carried into colonies from the Black Sea to Sicily, ensured the survival of its ideas. Later, Rome would adopt its logic of citizenship and deliberation. Centuries later, European societies would revisit the polis as a point of reference. That is because the polis was never tied to one monument or dynasty, but to practices that any willing community could adopt. However, the polis was not without weakness. Its small size made it vulnerable to rivalry and conflict. Neighbors fought bitter wars, alliances broke, and resources were stretched to the limit. Some polis collapsed under these pressures. Yet, these very disputes fostered resilience. To survive constant disagreements, communities had to sharpen their rhetoric, refine their laws, and improve their institutions. Fragility, paradoxically, cultivated strength. What endured was not military victory, but cultural innovation. Philosophy was born in this fragmented world, as thinkers pondered how nature worked and how societies should be organized. Rational inquiry gained legitimacy because no single ruler could entirely suppress debate. Political theory emerged from disputes among citizens, not from imposed decrees from palaces. The conditions of the polis, its equality in the phalanx, its assemblies of citizens, its laws restraining disorder, created the space where philosophy could thrive, tragedy could teach, and freedom could be tested anew. Even under the empire, the polis persisted. When Alexander's conquests reinstated monarchy in Greece, city-states still functioned within the larger framework. Their rituals, assemblies, and civic life continued, even if they were subordinate. This demonstrates why the polis was so resilient. It required no emperor to define it, nor did any dynasty need to uphold it. It needed only the agreement of citizens to speak, act, and remember together. That was sufficient to unify a community that in turn could inspire others. The polis united the threads we have traced. Palaces had fallen, leaving households to fend for themselves on the land. Farms became the foundation of self-reliance. Farmers turned soldiers in the phalanx, using their shields to teach cooperation. Assemblies transformed disputes into debate. Law balanced liberty and restraint. Poets and tragedians questioned gods. Philosophers tested reason, and citizens sought kleos through memory and recognition. Together, these strands formed more than a political entity. They created the polis, a vessel in which freedom, law, and reason were woven into the fabric of communal life. Each city-state appeared different in detail, some with aristocratic councils, others with broader assemblies. But the core principles were shared. Authority stemmed from the community, not from a throne. Law was based on agreement, not decree. Justice was debated, not simply imposed. These principles were not the monuments of dynasties, but habits that could be recreated wherever people chose to live under them. The significance lies here. What endured Greece's struggles was not dominion or empire, but a model of civic life. The polis showed that ordinary households could govern through shared freedom, justice, and reason, and that this arrangement could outlast palaces, dynasties, and kings. This marks the turning point of the story. The polis was fragile, never free from conflict, often unstable. Yet its invention endured because it was collective. It could be recreated, carried abroad, remembered, and adapted long after specific wars or rulers had faded. Empires left ruins, the polis left practices. And practices, when rooted in freedom, law, and reason, could last across centuries. This is where we leave the early Greek world, not with monuments, but with an invention that changed what it meant for people to live together. And from here, another chapter begins, one that will test those fragile practices in ways no earlier age could have imagined. From collapse came invention. Out of ruins, Greece shaped something distinct. Freedom grounded in law, greatness defined through community, and reason tested in open debate. From the ashes of palace collapse came the fragile, radical experiment that mattered most: citizens ruling with laws and reason, not kings ruling by divine fiat. The Polis was small, always vulnerable, yet its influence endured far beyond the walls of stone or the broken dynasties. It demonstrated how human communities, through hardship, could forge principles that lasted. And perhaps take a moment to reflect. How often do the most enduring breakthroughs arise not from power, but from loss?